Uruguay. El señor Washington Beltrán nos va a leer su breve informe mientras ellos se van acomodando ahí.
Gracias, que ya van.
Buenas tardes. Como dijo el presidente, es un breve resumen de un informe no muy largo que presentó Uruguay a la Asamblea de la CEI. El gobierno de Uruguay logró aprobar en la Cámara de Diputados a fines de 2013 un proyecto de ley de medios que regula el estatuto jurídico, el funcionamiento y los contenidos de los medios audiovisuales, pero hasta la fecha no ha sido considerado por el Senado de la República. El proyecto aprobado en diputados únicamente con los votos del gobernante Frente Amplio contiene disposiciones restrictivas para el ejercicio de la libertad de expresión. Tanto en la Cámara Baja como en la Cámara Alta, con las mayorías absolutas del partido de gobierno, las decisiones se toman por su sola voluntad. Desde el Poder Ejecutivo se ha anunciado que se propondrán cambios al proyecto cuando empiece su consideración en el Senado y se insistirá en la creación de un Consejo de Comunicación Audiovisual cuyas competencias son controlar contenidos de los medios audiovisuales, detectar incumplimientos, aplicar sanciones, revocación de frecuencias y sanciones económicas. En otro orden de cosas, el Parlamento modificó la Ley de Acceso a la Información Pública e introdujo limitaciones que incluso fueron votadas por un partido de la oposición, que es el Partido Nacional. La primera senadora del gobierno y esposa del presidente Mujica, Lucía Topolanqui, fue la promotora de estos cambios de la ley, aunque aclaró que la intención del gobierno no es restringir el acceso a la información. Topolanqui señaló: nos preguntamos si la sociedad tiene la madurez suficiente y el conocimiento para manejar esta ley. Con estos cambios, los jerarcas podrán, excepcionalmente, clasificar la información como reservada cuando reciban la solicitud de acceso, aun cuando estos datos antes no estuvieran en esa condición. Además, los organismos públicos podrán delegar información que forme parte de un proceso de toma de decisiones, licitación o control. Este es el resumen del resto del informe, que está en la página. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Washington. Queda a consideración el informe de Uruguay. Si nadie tiene nada para decir, muchas gracias. Bueno, y ahora voy a presentar un panel sobre un tema que nos tiene preocupados desde el año pasado particularmente, algo que no nos ocurría durante muchos años en Brasil, y es el estado de la libertad de prensa en Estados Unidos. Normalmente los informes de Estados Unidos eran como los de Costa Rica, o sea, pasaban y se leían las pocas cosas que había de críticas pero ahora desde el año pasado hemos tenido algunos alertas en esa materia. De hecho, este panel que van a integrar Gyllenhaal, McClatchy Newspapers en Washington DC, y Bill Roberts, que es el editor de la página editorial de Durango Herald. Si ustedes tienen allí el programa, parece bastante terrible lo que dice el programa. Lo voy a leer en inglés. The United States government maintains a rigid policy of control and restriction of the flow of information to news media, which results in excessive secrecy, little transparency, and limited access to official activities, affecting the watchdog role of the media over the public administration and becoming a serious obstruction to the practice of free journalism and press freedom. During the administration of President Barack Obama, they have been prosecuted more than in other administrations, numerous government officials for alleged leaking of matters of public interest. Following the questioned seizure of the AP phone records in 2012, the Department of Justice had to change its guidelines in the subpoenas and search warrants for journalists, but these do not guarantee protection of news sources. An unresolved matter pending in Congress was to pass a federal law to prevent journalists being required to reveal their sources of confidential information. It seems that we are talking about other countries than the U.S., but we are talking about the U.S. Voy a presentar a nuestros panelistas de hoy. Anders Gyllenhaal es vicepresidente de Noticias y editor radicado en Washington de McClatchy Company. Gyllenhaal fue editor ejecutivo del Miami Herald desde el año 2007. Entre el año 2002 y 2007 ocupó el cargo de director y vicepresidente senior en el Star Tribune en Minneapolis, la cadena McClatchy. Anteriormente fue director ejecutivo y vicepresidente de The News and Observer de Raleigh, Carolina del Norte. Gyllenhaal fue presidente de la Junta del Premio Pulitzer y sirvió en la Junta Pulitzer entre los años 2001 y 2010. Además, comenzó su carrera periodística en 1975 como reportero del Daily News Record en Harrisonburg, en Virginia. En el año 1977 se trasladó a The Press en Atlantic City, Nueva Jersey, y se unió al Miami Herald en el año 1979, donde trabajó como reportero de noticias locales, corresponsal en todo el estado, periodista de investigación y editor del condado Broward. En 1991, Gyllenhaal se trasladó a The News and Observer como editor de Metro y jefe de redacción antes de convertirse en editor en 1996. Podría decir más cosas porque tiene una larga carrera, pero voy a dejarlo hablar ahora del tema que nos interesa. Adelante.
Gracias, señor. Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, es un placer, gran placer estar aquí este fin de semana en esta conferencia con mis muchos amigos. Perdóname, pero mi español no es suficiente, claro, para hablar este tópico por muy largo, so I will switch here and in the process of talking about what's happening in the United States, try to answer the question which we were just whispering about. How true is that summary? I hope that summary was enough to get you here, although I think everyone here is pretty much aware of what's been happening in our country. And I will speak sort of on the national side, and Bill will talk about what's happening locally. And I think it's fair to say that this past year has seen the most significant changes in the U.S., both in journalism, particularly one sector of journalism, which is the deeper stories of national security, and the broad question of government openness and secrecies. And one of the most interesting things going on right now is that at a time when the government is trying to crack down in a lot of different ways on the flow of information, this has been the year when there has been more revelations, a greater depth of information coming out, often what the government doesn't want to be coming out, than ever before. So I think the question of can a government, particularly in the United States, suppress information? The answer is no, but that battle over it has been really extraordinary. So we're in a time when there's a lot of uncertainty hanging over our business. I have reporters who are covering national security, international events, and national events, and those that are working on these topics at the center of this, you have to assume that somebody is listening in on your phone calls. We have never really had that experience before. You have to, in the back of your mind, recognize that there could be a prosecution being developed. That is rare, and it's important to recognize that as far as the prosecution of journalists in particular, that is not a big part of what's happening. But you have to make these assumptions. So on sensitive topics, our reporters are using throwaway phones and we've had to learn how to use encryption devices, as many of you have over time. At the heart of this, of course, is the government's surveillance practices, which we've all been reading about since this time about last year. And it's important to note that it's not entirely clear of what's happening. Each revelation that's come has showed us that the breadth of this initiative is deeper and longer, and involves more and more than was known before that. So that the point at which you know that phone data and emails and location devices and kind of the compilation of all that can be then used to figure out, well, what are you as a news organization doing is being collected and stored. But all of this is up in the air because the reaction has been so strong. It's also important to note that it's hard to overstate the impact that this has had on journalism, but we are in the middle of this push and pull. So let me sort of break my thoughts into two parts. One is what we can say, what we do know, and the other is what we don't know and what that might mean. And I think everybody is recognizing that the government's surveillance and data mining practices accelerated dramatically after 9/11. Now, some of that is sanctioned by law, for instance, the U.S. Patriot Act, which passed, think about this, 6 weeks after the attacks on the United States. I mean, nothing happens in Congress in 6 weeks. Nothing happens in Congress anymore at all. But it's an extraordinary period. And it's also important to recognize what we as a country were thinking at that time. Because the reaction was a legitimate one in many respects. And the feelings and concerns clearly were very much warranted. But while some of this was happening in front of the public, a lot of things were going on which were not obvious. And only later did we become aware of the breadth of which this period led to a whole operation of tracking what's going on. And that began to come out, going back to the New York Times reporting of the warrantless wiretaps in 2006, and then followed up, in dramatic fashion by the documents released by Edward Snowden, working with Glenn Greenwald, Barton Gellman, and Laura Poitras. We also know that the Obama administration has significantly increased the crackdown on government workers. And this is where the prosecutions have occurred, as this summary says. There have been a whole series of prosecutions. In addition to that, a whole program to try to suppress the flow of information. And that ranges from wiretaps, which have always been questionable, but are now being used widespread, to all kinds of rules that require one government worker to report on another government worker. However, this has not gone that well. And the public reaction to a lot of these measures has been very strong and is changing the course of events. Meanwhile, the government really for the first time began to investigate in the current era, investigate journalists. The two most high-profile cases were the AP, as we talked about. 20 reporters had their phone calls and emails tapped for an investigation that seemed to be prepared. At the same time as James Rosen, a Fox News Washington correspondent, was being investigated the same way for his reporting on North Korea. He was labeled a criminal conspirator. Both of these cases began to move forward until the reaction came out. And it has been so strong that both of those have stalled and don't seem to be going anywhere. And then not long ago, Attorney General Eric Holder announced a whole series of changes in the government's approach to the press. They have not really gone into place. It's difficult to tell exactly how things will change, but I do think it's clear that part of that reaction, part of the widespread negative reaction to this has halted a lot of those measures. But all this has been overshadowed by what's happened to this amazing story that Edward Snowden was at the center of. it's important to recognize that according to the government, he hasn't said this, the government, 1.7 million documents were taken. And there's only been a handful of those documents that have been made public. So there's a lot more out there to see, and no one really knows exactly what that constitutes, what more there is to come. I think we can assume that the most significant developments have been revealed, but there's, it continues on, so that we're still in the midst of all this. So let me now turn to what we don't know and talk a little bit about some of those things. And I think one of the important questions is, how does the American public really feel about this? And that, particularly in a country like ours, the public reaction is a very powerful and often a determinant factor. When this all began to unfold, in fact, a little before that, the polling showed that roughly 60% of the public was in favor of the measures that were cracking down. There was a general support, about 60-30 with 10% undecided. And over the course of the last year, that is pretty much reversed. The last Gallup poll showed 55% public opposed, 30% in favor. So it has generally shifted. You've seen that in Congress as well. And when that kind of a shift occurs, you begin to see reaction. Of course, the president not long ago said we're going to take a deep look at this whole question, and they began to roll out some of those initiatives. Again, it's not clear how far these changes will go and what impact they're going to have on this whole apparatus that has been built. But it's an important thing to recognize that a change is underway. We also don't know a tremendous amount about what other governments in other countries are doing, and that's a really important question for this Congress. It's not nearly as clear, but there is a lot out on there. And we've heard a lot today about the surveillance that the Latin American countries are undertaking. It's interesting to note that the Snowden files included some revelations that we hadn't been aware of before that put a spotlight on Latin America. One of Glenn Greenwald's pieces focused on surveillance that the U.S. was doing of Latin American countries, particularly Colombia, Venezuela, Brazil, and Mexico. So there's a lot going on there. And of course, that created this huge reaction from presidents of these countries and other administration. But a lot of those complaints, we know, are hypocritical, because the same thing is happening on the part of Latin American governments, and notably Argentina, which we know has one of the most sophisticated surveillance mechanisms. Brazil is involved, and Venezuela we've heard about today. So there's a long history among all these governments. It's just a factor that the U.S. tends to play its troubles out in a very public way, and so we know a lot about that. And I think we could assume that the U.S. is leading the world, perhaps with competition from China, on how to pull this off. But it is happening everywhere. Nobody is innocent. The question I think that we have to wrestle with is, to what degree these revelations have compromised national security. And that's basically the government's argument. And that's any government's argument, but it's particularly the case in the ongoing dispute right now in the U.S. And of course, government officials ranging from presidents to military leaders have said that has occurred, that there have been consequences of this information flowing out. Interesting to note when the New York Times published the warrantless eavesdropping story, and they were in touch with the White House before publication, President Bush is famously reported to have said to them, "You're going to have blood on your hands." And of course, that's one of the things that often causes you as an editor, doesn't have to be as strong a statement as that, to question what's going to happen. They went ahead with the story. There was no evidence of that ever occurring. And a really important question, and I think is part of the issue we should be watching as this unfolds. The same allegations were made at the height of the WikiLeaks releases, which is a somewhat different arena, but all part of the same ongoing saga And I should add that McClatchy newspapers, our papers, were a partner with WikiLeaks for a portion of the time that the major releases were occurring. And you have to stop and think hard about each of these decisions. Do you participate in something? You don't always know where it's going to go. In the end, I think that was a good thing to do. The government claimed in relation to WikiLeaks that there were dire consequences from that. And we've never really seen that. I would argue now, in sort of retrospect, that the primary revelation of WikiLeaks, there were plenty of embarrassments, plenty of diplomats saying things behind closed doors that they didn't really want to get out, and a lot of patching up that had to go. But what you really saw from the lion's share of those documents was a bunch of government workers doing what they said they were doing, working in a pretty straightforward way to try to solve problems. And I think the overall portrait was not a negative one of the U.S., even though there were plenty of elements of that people were very unhappy with. Let me end with a couple of questions that I think go to the heart of these issues. And one of them is, to what degree have all these revelations about the U.S.'s surveillance programs set back our country as a role, in its role as a defender and promoter of openness? I mean, that's part of what our mantra is. We are supporting democracy. We want there to be openness and transparency. We heard a top State Department official here this morning say, we need to see more openness in Latin America. That doesn't ring as quite the same way here as it might have a year ago when we know what the government is doing. And so how has this affected that very important role? I think it's a role we all see as important. Do we have the same strength in that argument? Another question is, what's it going to take for governments to restore the credibility that they have lost from all this? Before this past year, it was rare when a national security story was published. There were not very many. It was a tough place to do work. And now we've had this avalanche of stories. And when the government tells you you can't publish that because it's going to hurt our cause, there's a little bit of crying wolf built into this. And so it's a really tricky thing for governments to try to make the arguments they do when you have these stories that you shouldn't publish. And so you're seeing an awful lot of stories playing out now that you didn't not too long ago. And then the final question is, what is the acceptable level of surveillance? It's a very tough question to answer, but it really isn't that at the center of things. Who determines that, and how much say should the public have? When the Snowden revelations were first made public, President Obama, in one of several speeches, said, now we're going to have a debate about this whole question. It's a new question. It's a tough question. How deep, how much watching should be taking place? And has that debate occurred? I would say that it has not fully occurred. That there have been certainly congressional reviews. There's been some discussion, but we're really still at the very beginning of that question. And it's a hard one, and it's a hugely important one that needs to be answered. And I think that that's something we're going to see play out in the next couple of years. And I hope it ends up being one that will continue to lead the overall strategy, the global strategy for openness and transparency, but we will see. Thank you.
Thank you, Andres. Now it's the turn of Bill Roberts. Bill Roberts es editor de la página editorial de Durango, Herald, cargo que ha ocupado desde el año 1990. Ha ganado numerosos premios por sus editoriales y columnas ocasionales. Residente de larga data en Durango, comenzó a trabajar en el Herald después de una carrera en el negocio de los restaurantes.
afraid that's all the Spanish is getting me. Anders is right. We are looking at this in a different perspective. The Durango Herald is a small-town newspaper. And it's four sister publications, all small weeklies, all located in southwest Colorado, and about as remote an area as you can get in the 48 particular states. And we're looking at issues of freedom of the press in an entirely retail fashion. This is one-on-one. We're not dealing with the NSA. We're not dealing with Congress or the FBI. We're dealing with what can seem like mundane, even boring issues with school boards, city councils, town boards, and county commissioners. It's a little difficult speaking to a group of people who include folks from Venezuela or Mexico or other areas where journalism is a life and death. It's not for us. The worst we get is a nasty phone call, cancel subscription, usually over our phones. But it's a continuum. And theft cannot be compared to murder. Except, of course, that they're both crimes, and they're all on this continuum of crime. Whether school boards excluding people from meetings ever leads to murder and intimidation, I don't know, but it is on that continuum. It is part of that denial of the information that is the lifeblood of journalism and democracy. The threats we face, it's not a frontal assault, it's more like erosion. It's not violence, it's more apathy and ignorance. And while those are not anywhere near as fearsome, they do real damage. It's as much a question of freedom of information as it is actually freedom of the press. We can't tell the public what they need to know if we can't find that out. And that works on several levels anymore. Locally, most states, perhaps all 50 states, have what are called sunshine laws, laws that require openness in government. They vary in their level of stringency, their strength, and what the penalties might be, most of which actually are fairly weak. We also have open records laws, and some states have shield laws that protect reporters from being forced to reveal their sources. Colorado does not. And there is a case right now where a Fox News reporter revealed some information about a trial, the guy who shot up a theater in Aurora and killed a bunch of people. She is being subpoenaed to testify. Luckily for her, she lives in New York. New York has a strong shield law, and the Supreme Court there ruled that she did not have to testify. That's probably going to end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. And we have things like the Secretary of the Interior met with the governor and some other people and shut the door in front of the local newspaper in Craig, Colorado. That, I don't think ever went anywhere. I think it was an apology, but that's about as far as it got. We deal all the time with court records that are sealed. There's a famous murder case in Denver, a very brutal crime, where the trial was completely open, but then the judge sealed the records. Locally, we have issues where the city council goes and does something in secret. There was a case where we have an Indian reservation very near us. The Indian tribes are not subject to state law. It's an extraordinarily complicated legal situation. But the local county commissioners met with the tribal commission, and the tribe shut the door. Well, at that point, our county commissioners should have raised their hands and said, wait, we can't do this, because at that point they were in violation of law. They didn't think of it. And that's the level we're dealing with. They didn't know, or they just didn't think about it, or they just didn't care. And it's our task to nag them. And it really comes down to that, just constantly reminding them of what their responsibilities are under the law, what our rights are under the law, and what the public's rights are. That goes a long way, actually. There's a yearly event we call Sunshine Week. It's sponsored in different states by different groups. In Colorado, it's the Freedom of Information Council. And our managing editor will assign reporters to a circumstance that's not their normal beat, have them go in and ask for some piece of information to see what happens. And as often as not, they're met by officials with just rolling eyes and a shrug of the shoulders. And too often, the stories that result in this are met on the public's behalf with just apathy. We have to prove to them why this matters. Of course, as soon as somebody's caught with their finger in the till, they want us to find out about it. But it begins with this day-to-day, really rather tedious process. Why there's so much problem with that at the local level, I think there's a number of reasons. One is no lawyer's ever been disbarred for telling a client to shut up. Officials have a natural aversion to publicity, especially when it involves the minutiae of what they're doing. There is, as I said, a lot of ignorance of the law. The public, frankly, it's hard to keep them interested in school board decisions and what the county commissioners are up to unless it's the road in front of their house. And we also have an issue with all sorts of new media and attention spans. I saw something a week or two ago, and I wish I could tell you who I'm quoting, but the guy said, which we have at our fingertips today, the sum total of human knowledge instantly available to us. And we use it to send pictures of cats. We are competing with a media climate where we are all bombarded constantly from all different sources, often by information that is a whole lot sexier or more gruesome than a school board meeting. And we have to compete with that. I don't have all the answers on that one. I'm not sure I have any of them. But we do need to do a better job of educating the public about our role, how to read a newspaper, how to look at a website, how to process and absorb information in a critical and rational way. That there is a difference between a news story and a reputable newspaper, whether that's in print or online or on your phone or whatever. There's a difference between that and rumor, gossip, and the Facebook posts of my niece who says she's hungry. These are all on a different level, and we need to educate the public more as to how to actually make those perceptions. Because how they see things affects how we can do our jobs. There is a supply side and a demand side to news, to opinion, to advertising, to all of it. And if we are cut off from the information to begin with, or if we're trying to reach an audience that doesn't feel like a school board meeting or a county commissioners meeting is interesting, then what we're doing in the middle is really of little consequence. So, I don't know. Like I said, I don't have any answers. I don't know how we can stay relevant in a way that keeps up with changing technologies and social trends without simply being distracted by what's shiny. But I was very much taken with an earlier panel with Lord Lester and Christopher Barnes. I like the phrase, journalism is a profession, not just a business. I think we should bear that in mind. I'm going to try to do it. Because journalists can be killed. Again, I certainly don't want to equate our getting thrown out of the county commissioners meeting with what goes on with cartels But individuals can be killed or intimidated, but journalism can also be starved. It can be starved of revenue, of talent that goes elsewhere, of the information that's at the very core of what we do. In the end, whether that is horrifying or simply boring, the end result is going to look a lot like tyranny. And to conclude, I would like to refer back to an earlier speaker, the gentleman from Venezuela, who reminded us that without journalism there is no democracy. And I think if we forget that, we're going to be left with pictures of cats.
Thank you, David. Voy a tomar algunas preguntas de la sala, si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta. Sí, adelante. Por favor, identificarse.
Ricardo Lizano de Costa Rica. You know, my English is deteriorating, so I don't know in Spanish. Tradicionalmente hemos tenido a América Latina y el periodismo norteamericano como un modelo a seguir. Yo incluso estudié en la Universidad de Luisiana y en algún momento recibí un programa de fellowship del programa del Departamento de Estado. Sin embargo, las intervenciones suyas los dejan a uno bastante escéptico, por decirlo menos, con relación a un periodismo que siempre hemos tenido como modelo, con relación a lo que debe ser el modelo de periodismo que se debe practicar en una democracia, particularmente con lo que señalaba el señor Robert, que la democracia sin periodismo pues, no existe. Está desde este punto de vista amenazada tanto la prensa como la democracia en Estados Unidos.
I would say that this is not a new story, that there has been a friction that has risen and fallen with the times, in our country for 200 plus years. So even though there's reasons for concern, and I think the summary here, which does overstate things, makes the point that this push and pull, particularly when there's national security thrown into the mix, is going to be severe. However, the reason I think that I would dispute the gist of what we say here is because the press remains very strong. Even with some of the economic instability we've seen. As I mentioned earlier, there hasn't been so much flow of information around these very important topics at the same time as they're trying to crack down. So it's not working. I think it's important to show that strength, and that press now is a much more complicated animal than it was 10 years ago, which I think helps in certain ways, with all the electronic tools that we have. So I'm optimistic, even though we are in a time of, I think, real friction, that most of the public, and I think you see the public recognizing this, understands that even they don't like us, sometimes they don't even, the press's esteem is held pretty low, but folks recognize, maybe not Durango, but I think they recognize the importance of it. And as our papers have placed more emphasis on watchdog investigative work in this time, that's been one of our messages. We have to dig deeper. We've seen a real response from the public. So I would be generally optimistic, even though it's a difficult time.
Lee, do you want to say something?
I would not say democracy and journalism are under attack. The word I used earlier was erosion. And I think that, as Andre said, this is a battle that's been going on forever. It changes shape, it changes form, it changes exactly how it plays out. But Yeah, it is a constant struggle, and it requires vigilance. Democracy is not easy. And we find the Herald and its sister papers are essentially the only news gathering organization in about a 4-hour drive in any radius. So what we find is that people who don't like us, or don't like our opinions, or don't like the picture of their kid being at a football game, will still come to us for their information when they need it. They may not read us or buy the paper as often as we'd like, but when it matters to them, they look at us. I find that hard.
Thank you. Mauricio.
Mauricio Salgado, el diario de hoy, El Salvador. I just wanted to make an addendum comment to the surveillance of the United States on foreign nationals. There is an entire program in El Salvador that is adjunct to the Attorney General's office that seeks to surveil criminal organizations that have been identified to be collaborating with other criminals in U.S. soil, and as a matter of fact, murders of U.S. nationals in U.S. soil have been committed, and some of them have been apprehended through these surveillance efforts. And what I'm trying to say is that sometimes there are legitimate elements and claims to the surveillance efforts, and the tricky part is to separate what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. But I wanted to bring forth something that we live in a country that has to do with surveillance, supported openly on the table by State Department effort in conjunction with an Attorney General's office is a question of ours.
A really good point, and of course, on this kind of a panel, we're talking mostly about the impacts on journalism. But that's why I do feel like the discussion needs to take place. And it's not an easy one. Well, where is the line really going to end up being? And it is a dangerous world, and we're also in a global world now. And that's one of the dramatic changes that's occurred. This is a genuinely global world. Journalism is becoming global too, which is an interesting point. If you think about the Snowden case, I'm a little off the question, but I think this is something worth spending time on. That story was broken by a whole collection of characters who weren't in mainstream media, although they used mainstream media, and who went to papers that were based in both Washington and London with an international impact. So there's a lot of changes that are taking place that I think are going to lead us to trying to figure out, well, where is the right place, and what's the right role of surveillance, which, again, it is, as you say, an important tool for the government, but only when it's used well, and only when we're aware of what the rules are. I think that's one of the problems we face in all these revelations, that this was not public, it was not known, and when it's not known, that's when it's open for abuse.
I just have a question, and I say in Spanish. Anders manejó una cifra. Un 60% de la población de la sociedad de Estados Unidos estaba conforme con dejar primar la seguridad y bajar un poco las libertades individuales, justamente para tener más seguridad. ¿No podría decir, de acuerdo con esa cifra, de que después de los atentados del 11 de septiembre, la sociedad de Estados Unidos, tan celosa de sus libertades individuales en el pasado, cambió en sus fundamentos, en una parte esencial, de manera tal de que ahora está más proclive a aceptar limitaciones sobre su libertad que antes?
Well, it's a complicated question, and one that I think we need to be very careful with. I wouldn't summarize those figures 60-30 as folks endorsing surveillance over freedoms. I think the question fundamentally was, do you support an increase in surveillance, and do you support the direction the country is going to try to deal with a threat that, was a life and death threat and continues to be? Now we're swinging back because, we do always, all societies tend to overreact when there's been calamity. And so, we I think, felt very threatened and wanted to see measures taken, no matter almost what they were. And I think that's what we saw in the Patriot Act, which also included a lot of necessary provisions. And now we're swinging back, and I think we have to be aware that if there are more incidents, and there will be, that may shift around some. I think that the U.S. population is very much aware of those principles. It's just very hard after a calamity like 9/11 to stand up for them. And I think in the end, the country has done a pretty good job of that. But we'll see that pendulum swinging back and forth.
I'd just reinforce what Anders just said. If you look throughout American history, we react to calamities, sometimes heroically, but sometimes and even simultaneously hysterically. During the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, who's rightly revered right now, was essentially a dictator. And right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States reacted not only heroically, but also with some pretty ugly racist behavior. And we got over it, we fixed it. 20 years after that, we had the Civil Rights Revolution.
Bueno, quiero agradecer profundamente a Anders y a Bill por haber estado con nosotros. Ha sido un honor tener este panel y pido por favor un aplauso para nuestros invitados. I'm calling from here, Ricardo Trotti, to read para leer un resumen del informe de Cuba, por favor. Nuestra vicepresidenta regional para Cuba, Joanny Sánchez, no pudo venir y por eso Ricardo Trotti iba a leer el informe de Cuba resumiéndolo.
Gracias, Claudio. Un resumen del informe de Cuba que, como saben, está incluido también en nuestra página web. Cuba. En el país prosiguen las reformas, la más reciente de las cuales fue la aprobación de una nueva ley para la inversión extranjera, con un mayor margen de beneficios para los inversionistas. Mientras tanto, la esfera política no parece haber sido siquiera considerada como objeto de cambios, incluida la represión contra las libertades individuales de prensa y de expresión. Prosiguen sin alteración las prácticas de golpizas, detenciones, intimidaciones, actos de vandalismo y el hostigamiento contra opositores. Paralelamente, tampoco se han detenido las manifestaciones de protesta de la oposición o el trabajo de periodistas y blogueros independientes, al igual que el debate en círculos oficiosos e independientes de los problemas del país y de la necesidad de democratizar la sociedad. La prensa oficial cubana sigue siendo el vehículo de propaganda de siempre y niega a la población la información sobre lo que acontece dentro y fuera del país. Por ejemplo, la cobertura de las protestas en Venezuela es inexistente. Las noticias acerca de ese país se presentan a través de discursos y comparecencias de Nicolás Maduro y otros líderes del chavismo. Por otra parte, el porcentaje de conectividad a Internet es de solo un 15% en Cuba. La empresa estatal de telecomunicaciones dijo que prevé ofrecer a finales de 2014 conexiones a Internet en los hogares. Además, la misma empresa informó que abrirá nuevos servicios a la telefonía celular, entre ellos correo electrónico y navegación por Internet, aunque no hay información definitiva sobre las tarifas y se especula que serán astronómicas, concebidas para captar divisas desde el exterior, mayormente de Estados Unidos, desde donde se realizan los pagos de conexión a celulares. En febrero, la agencia Associated Press retiró 7 fotos del ex comandante Fidel Castro, pues algunas fueron alteradas digitalmente. Las imágenes fueron difundidas por Estudios Revolución, una entidad gubernamental que distribuye imágenes de funcionarios y actividades de gobiernos durante la reciente cumbre de Latinoamérica y el Caribe en La Habana. Para terminar este resumen, el ex contratista de la Agencia Estadounidense para el Desarrollo Internacional, Alan Gross, continúa en prisión. Y a principios de marzo, el gobierno de Raúl Castro informó de su disposición a negociar un acuerdo de diálogo político y de cooperación con la Unión Europea, con vistas a acompañar las supuestas reformas en la isla y apoyar un mayor respeto por los derechos humanos. Algunos países, sin embargo, como Alemania, Polonia y la República Checa, han exigido supervisar que haya medidas que contemplen el respeto a las libertades políticas y a la libertad de expresión en la isla.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo. Está a consideración el informe de Cuba. Mi comentario, muchas gracias, Ricardo. Le voy a pedir a José Roberto Dutriz si nos puede leer brevemente el informe de ahí, de El Salvador, pero antes de que él empiece voy a reiterar una información que ya di en esta asamblea, pero que algunos todavía no escucharon, y por eso para mejor informar voy a reiterar que la CIP ha resuelto enviar a Perú una misión exploratoria como consecuencia de la controversia que hay en ese país entre medios de comunicación y periodistas sobre una presunta concentración de medios, y además por el hecho de que el presidente Ollanta Humala y el gobierno han insinuado la posibilidad de regular, crear una ley para regular la prensa en Perú, algo contra lo cual la CIP ya se ha pronunciado en contra. Pero vamos a hacer una misión exploratoria, en inglés una fact-finding mission, y vamos a anunciar la fecha en las próximas semanas. Ahora sí, José Roberto, por favor.
Gracias, presidente.